Knitting is a method by which yarn is manipulated to create a textile or fabric. Knitting creates multiple loops of yarn, called stitches, in a line or tube. Knitting has multiple active stitches on the needle at one time. Knitted fabric consists of a number of consecutive rows of interlocking loops. As each row progresses, a newly created loop is pulled through one or more loops from the prior row, placed on the beginning needle, and the loops from the prior row are then pulled off the other needle. Knitting may be done by hand or by using a machine. Different types of yarns, needle sizes, and stitch types may be used to achieve knitted fabrics with diverse properties. Structure. Courses and wales like weaving. Knitting is a technique for producing a two-dimensional fabric made from a one-dimensional yarn of thread. In weaving, threads are always straight, running parallel either lengthwise or crosswise. By contrast, the yarn in knitted fabrics follows a meandering path, forming symmetric loops symmetrically above and below the mean path of the yarn. These meandering loops can be easily stretched in different directions, giving knit fabrics much more elasticity than woven fabrics. Depending on the yarn and knitting pattern, knitted garments can stretch as much as 500%. For this reason, knitting was initially developed for garments that must be elastic or stretch in response to the wearer's motions, such as socks and hosiery. For comparison, woven garments stretch mainly along one or other of a related pair of directions that lie roughly diagonally between the warp and the weft, while contracting in the other direction of the pair, and not very elastic, unless they are woven from stretchable materials such as spandex. Knitted garments are often more form-fitting than woven garments, since their elasticity allows them to contour to the body's outline more closely. By contrast, curvature is introduced into most woven garments only with sewn darts, flares, gussets and gauze, the seams of which lower the elasticity of the woven fabric still further. Extra curvature can be introduced into knitted garments without seams, as in the heel of a sock. The effect of darts, flares, etc. can be obtained with short rows or by increasing or decreasing the number of stitches. Thread used in weaving is usually much finer than the yarn used in knitting, which can give the knitted fabric more bulk and less drape than a woven fabric. If they are not secured, the loops of a knitted course will come undone when the yarn is pulled. This is known as ripping out, unraveling knitting, or humorously, frogging. To secure a stitch, at least one new loop is passed through it. Although the new stitch is itself unsecured, it secures the stitch suspended from it. A sequence of stitches in which each stitch is suspended from the next is called a wale. To secure the initial stitches of a knitted fabric, a method for casting on is used. To secure the final stitches in a wale, one uses a method of binding, casting off. During knitting, the active stitches are secured mechanically, either from individual hooks or from a knitting needle or frame. In hand knitting, weft and warp knitting, there are two major varieties of knitting: weft knitting and warp knitting. In the more common weft knitting, the wales are perpendicular to the course of the yarn. In warp knitting, the wales and courses run roughly parallel. In weft knitting, the entire fabric may be produced from a single yarn by adding stitches to each wale in turn, moving across the fabric as in a raster scan. By contrast, in warp knitting, one yarn is required for every wale. Since a typical piece of knitted fabric may have hundreds of wales, warp knitting is typically done by machine, whereas weft knitting is done by both hand and machine. Warp knitted fabrics such as tricot and Milanese are resistant to runs, and are commonly used in lingerie. Weft knit fabrics may also be knit with multiple yarns, usually to produce interesting color patterns. The two most common approaches are intarsia and stranded colorwork. In intarsia, the yarns are used in well-segregated regions, e.g. a red apple on a field of green. In that case, the yarns are kept on separate spools and only one is knitted at any time. In the more complex stranded approach, two or more yarns alternate repeatedly within one row and all the yarns must be carried along the row, as seen in Fair Isle sweaters. Double knitting can produce two separate knitted fabrics simultaneously. However, the two fabrics are usually integrated into one, giving it great warmth and excellent drape. Knit and purl stitches in securing the previous stitch in a wale. The next stitch can pass through the previous loop from either below or above. If the former, the stitch is denoted as a knit stitch or a plain stitch. If the latter, as a purl stitch. The two stitches are related in that a knit stitch seen from one side of the fabric appears as a purl stitch on the other side. The two types of stitches have a different visual effect. The knit stitches look like V's stacked vertically, whereas the purl stitches look like a wavy horizontal line across the fabric. Patterns and pictures can be created in knitted fabrics by using knit and purl stitches as pixels. However, such pixels are usually rectangular, rather than square, depending on the gauge tension of the knitting. Individual stitches, or rows of stitches, may be made taller by drawing more yarn into the new loop, which is the basis for uneven knitting. A row of tall stitches may alternate with one or more rows of short stitches for an interesting visual effect. Short and tall stitches may also alternate within a row, forming a fish-like oval pattern. In the simplest knitted fabrics, all the stitches are knit or purl. This is known as a garter stitch. Alternating rows of knit stitches and purl stitches produce what is known as a stocky knit pattern, stocking stitch. Vertical stripes are possible by having alternating wales of knit and purl stitch. For example, a common choice is 2x2 ribbing, in which two wales of knit stitches are followed by two wales of purl stitches, etc. Horizontal striping is also possible by alternating rows of knit and purl stitch. Checkerboard patterns are also possible, the smallest of which is known as seed moss stitch. The stitches alternate between knit and purl in every wale and along every row. Fabrics in which the number of knit and purl stitches are not the same, such as stocky knit, stocking stitch, have a tendency to curl. By contrast, those in which knit and purl stitches are arranged symmetrically tend to lie flat and drape well. Wales of purl stitches have a tendency to recede, whereas those of knit stitches tend to come forward. Thus, the purl wales in ribbing tend to be invisible, since the neighboring knit wales come forward. Conversely, rows of purl stitches tend to form an embossed ridge relative to a row of knit stitch. This is the basis of shadow knitting, in which the appearance of a knitted fabric changes when viewed from different directions. Typically, a new stitch is passed through a single unsecured loop, thus lengthening that wale by one stitch. However, this need not be so. The new loop may be passed through an already secured stitch lower down on the fabric, or even between secured stitches, depending on the distance between where the loop is drawn through the fabric and where it is knitted. Dip stitches can produce a subtle stippling along lines across the surface of the fabric, e.g., the lower leaves of a flower. The new loop may also be passed between two stitches in the present row, thus clustering the intervening stitches. This approach is often used to produce a smocking effect in the fabric. The new loop may also be passed through two or more previous stitches, producing a decrease and merging wales together. The merged stitches need not be from the same row. For example, a tuck can be formed by knitting stitches together from two different rows, producing a raised horizontal welt on the fabric. Not every stitch in a row need be knitted. Some may be left as is unknitted on a subsequent row. This is known as slip stitch knitting. The slip stitches are naturally longer than the knitted ones. For example, a stitch slipped for one row before knitting would be roughly twice as tall as its knitted counterparts. This can produce interesting visual effects, although the resulting fabric is more rigid because the slip stitch pulls on its neighbors and is less deformable. Mosaic knitting is a form of slip stitch knitting that knits alternate colored rows and uses slip stitches to form patterns. Mosaic knit fabrics tend to be stiffer than patterned fabrics produced by other methods such as fair isle knitting. In some cases, a stitch may be deliberately left unsecured by a new stitch and its wale allowed to disassemble. This is known as drop stitch knitting and produces a vertical ladder of see-through holes in the fabric, corresponding to where the wale had been. Right and left plaited stitches, both knit and purl stitches, may be twisted, usually once if at all, but sometimes twice and thrice. When seen from above, the twist can be clockwise or counterclockwise. These are denoted as right and left plaited stitches, respectively. Hand knitters generally produce right plaited stitches by knitting or purling through the back loops, i.e., passing the needle through the initial stitch in an unusual way, but wrapping the yarn as usual. By contrast, the left plaited stitch is generally formed by hand knitters by wrapping the yarn in the opposite way, rather than by any change in the needle. Although they are mirror images in form, right and left plaited stitches are functionally equivalent. Both types of plaited stitches give a subtle but interesting visual texture and tend to draw the fabric inwards, making it stiffer. Plaited stitches are a common method for knitting jewelry from fine metal wire. Edges and joins between fabrics. The initial and final edges of a knitted fabric are known as the cast-on and bound cast-off edges. The side edges are known as the self edges. The word derives from self edges, meaning that the stitches do not need to be secured by anything else. Many types of self edges have been developed, with different elastic and ornamental properties. Vertical and horizontal edges can be introduced within a knitted fabric, e.g., for buttonholes, by binding, casting off and recasting on again, or by knitting the fabrics on either side of a vertical edge separately. Two knitted fabrics can be joined by embroidery-based grafting methods, most commonly the Kitchener stitch. New wales can be begun from any of the edges of a knitted fabric. This is known as picking up stitches and is the basis for interlock, in which the wales run perpendicular to one another in a checkerboard pattern. Cables, increases, and lace. Ordinarily, stitches are knitted in the same order in every row, and the wales of the fabric run parallel and vertically along the fabric. However, this need not be so, since the order in which stitches are knitted may be permuted so that wales cross over one another, forming a cable pattern. Cables patterns tend to draw the fabric together, making it denser and less elastic. Aran sweaters are a common form of knitted cabling. Arbitrarily complex braid patterns can be done in cable knitting, with the proviso that the wales must move ever upwards. It is generally impossible for a wale to move up and then down the fabric. Knitters have developed methods for giving the illusion of a circular wale, such as appear in Celtic knots, but these are inexact approximations. However, such circular wales are possible using Swiss darning, a form of embroidery, or by knitting a tube separately and attaching it to the knitted fabric. A wale can split into two or more wales using increases, most commonly involving a yarn over. Depending on how the increase is done, there is often a hole in the fabric at the point of the increase. This is used to great effect in lace knitting, which consists of making patterns and pictures using such holes, rather than with the stitches themselves. The large and many holes in lace knitting makes it extremely elastic. For example, Some Shetland wedding ring shawls are so fine that they may be drawn through a wedding ring. By combining increases and decreases, it is possible to make the direction of a wale slant away from vertical, even in weft knitting. This is the basis for bias knitting and can be used for visual effect, similar to the direction of a brushstroke in oil painting. Ornamentations and additions. Various point-like ornaments may be added to knitting for the look to improve the wear of the fabric. Examples include various types of baubles, sequins and beads. Long loops can also be drawn out and secured, forming a shaggy texture to the fabric. This is known as loop knitting. Additional patterns can be made on the surface of the knitted fabric using embroidery. If the embroidery resembles knitting, it is often called Swiss darning. Various closures for the garments, such as frogs and buttons, can be added. Usually buttonholes are knitted into the garment, rather than cut. Ornamental pieces may also be knitted separately and then attached using applique. For example, differently colored leaves and petals of a flower could be knit separately and attached to form the final picture. Separately knitted tubes can be applied to a knitted fabric to form complex Celtic knots and other patterns that would be difficult to knit. Unknitted yarns may be worked into knitted fabrics for warmth, as is done in tufting and weaving. History and culture. The word is derived from knot and ultimately from the Old English snitten, to knot. Gnarly binding is a fabric creation technique predating both knitting and crochet. That said, one of the earliest known examples of true knitting was cotton socks with stranded knit color patterns found in Egypt from the end of the 1st millennium AD. The first commercial knitting guilds appear in Western Europe in the early 15th century. The Guild of St. Fiacre was founded in Paris in 1527, but the archives mention an organization of knitters from 1268. With the invention of the knitting machine, knitting by hand became a craft used by country people with easy access to fiber. Similar to quilting, spinning, and needlepoint, hand knitting became a leisure activity for the wealthy. Properties of fabrics. The topology of a knitted fabric is relatively complex. Unlike woven fabrics, where strands usually run straight horizontally and vertically, yarn that has been knitted follows a looped path along its row, as with the red strand in the diagram at left, in which the loops of one row have all been pulled through the loops of the row below it. Because there is no single straight line of yarn anywhere in the pattern, a knitted piece of fabric can stretch in all directions. This elasticity is all but unavailable in woven fabrics, which only stretch along the bias. Many modern stretchy garments, even as they rely on elastic synthetic materials for some stretch, also achieve at least some of the stretch through knitted patterns. The basic knitted fabric has a definite right side and wrong side. On the right side, the visible portions of the loops of the verticals connecting two rows, which are arranged in a grid of V shapes. On the wrong side, the ends of the loops are visible, both the tops and bottoms, creating a much more bumpy texture, sometimes called reverse stockinette, because the yarn holding rows together is all on the front, and the yarn holding side-by-side stitches together is all on the back. Stockinette fabric has a strong tendency to curl toward the front on the top and bottom, and toward the back on the left and right side. Stitches can be worked from either side, and various patterns are created by mixing regular knit stitches with the wrong side stitches, known as purl stitches, either in columns, rows, or more complex patterns. Each fabric has different properties. A garter stitch has much more vertical stretch, while ribbing stretch has much more horizontally. Because of the front-back symmetry, these two fabrics have little curl, making them popular as edging, even when the stretch properties are not desired. Different combinations of knit and purl stitches, along with more advanced techniques, generate fabrics of considerably variable consistency. from gauzy to very dense, from highly stretchy to relatively stiff, from flat to tightly curled, and so on. Texture. The most common texture for a knitted garment is that generated by the flat stocky knit stitch, as seen, though very small, in machine-made stockings and t-shirts, which is worked in the round as nothing but knit stitch, and worked flat as alternating rows of knit and purl. Other simple textures can be made with nothing but knit and purl stitches, including garter stitch, ribbing, and moss and seed stitch. Adding a slip stitch allows for a wide range of textures, including heel and linen stitches, as well as a number of more complicated patterns. Some more advanced knitting techniques create a surprising variety of complex textures, combining certain increases, which can create small eyelet holes in the resulting fabric, with assorted decreases is key to creating knitted lace, a very open fabric resembling lace. Open vertical stripes can be created using the drop stitch knitting technique, changing the order of stitches from one row to the next, usually with the help of a cable needle. A stitch holder is key to cable knitting, producing an endless variety of cables, honeycombs, ropes, and Aran sweater patterning. Entrelac forms a rich checkerboard texture by knitting small squares, picking up the side edges, and knitting more squares to continue to the piece. Fair Isle knitting uses two or more colored yarns to create patterns and forms a thicker and less flexible fabric. The appearance of a garment is also affected by the weight of the yarn, which describes the thickness of the spun fiber. The thicker the yarn, the more visible and apparent stitches will be. The thinner the yarn, the finer the texture. Color. Plenty of finished knitting projects never use more than a single color of yarn, but there are many ways to work in multiple colors. Some yarns are dyed to be either variegated or self-striping. More complicated techniques permit large fields of color, busy small-scale patterns of color, or both. Yarn with multiple shades of the same hue are called ombre, while a yarn with multiple hues may be known as a given colorway. A green, red and yellow yarn might be dubbed the parrot colorway by its manufacturer. For example, feathered yarns contain small amounts of fiber of different colors, while tweed yarns may have greater amounts of different colored fibers. Hand knitting process. There are many hundreds of different knitting stitches used by hand knitters. A piece of hand knitting begins with the process of casting on, which involves the initial creation of the stitches on the needle. Different methods of casting on are used for different effects. One may be stretchy enough for lace, while another provides a decorative edging. Provisional cast-ons are used when the knitting will continue in both directions from the cast-on. There are various methods employed to cast on, such as the thumb method, where the stitches are created by a series of loops that will, when knitted, give a very loose edge, ideal for picking up stitches and knitting a border. The double needle method, whereby each loop placed on the needle is then knitted on, which produces a firm edge ideal on its own as a border, and many more. The number of active stitches remains the same as when cast on unless stitches are added or removed. Most Western-style hand knitters follow either the English style or the continental style. There are also different ways to insert the needle into the stitch. Knitting through the front of a stitch is called Western knitting. Going through the back of a stitch is called Eastern knitting. A third method, called combination knitting, goes through the front of a knit stitch and the back of a purl stitch. Once the hand-knitted piece is finished, the remaining live stitches are cast off. Casting off loops the stitches across each other so they can be removed from the needle without unraveling the item. Although the mechanics are different from casting on, there is a similar variety of methods in hand knitting certain articles of clothing, especially larger ones like sweaters. The final knitted garment will be made of several knitted pieces, with individual sections of the garment hand knitted separately and then sewn together. Seamless knitting, where a whole garment is hand knit as a single piece, is also possible. Elizabeth Zimmerman is probably the best-known proponent of seamless circular hand knitting techniques. Smaller items, such as socks and hats, are usually knit in one piece on double-pointed needles or circular needles. Hats in particular can be started top-down on double-pointed needles with the increases added until the preferred size is achieved, switching to an appropriate circular needle when enough stitches have been added. Care must be taken to bind off at a tension that will allow the give needed to comfortably fit on the head. Mega knitting. Mega knitting is a term recently coined and relates to the use of knitting needles greater than or equal to ½ an inch in diameter. Mega knitting uses the same stitches and techniques as conventional knitting, except that hooks are carved into the ends of the needles. The hooked needles greatly enhance control of the work, catching the stitches and preventing them from slipping off. It was the development of the knitting machine that introduced hooked needles and enabled faultless, automated knitting. Most knitters probably aren't even aware of the many processes that the fingers perform in the making of a single stitch. However, large-gauge needles emphasize those actions, and knitting becomes increasingly more awkward when the needle diameter is greater than the width of the knitter's finger. On a 1-inch diameter needle, for instance, the shaft begins to taper 1 3/4 inches from the tip. This means that the stitches have spread much further apart on mega knitting needles, making them more difficult to control. The hook catches the loop of yarn as each stitch is knitted, meaning that wrists and fingers don't have to work so hard and there is less chance of stitches slipping off the needle. The position of the hook is most important. Turn the left hook to face away at all times. Turn the right hook toward you up whilst knitting and away whilst purling. Mega knitting produces a chunky, bulky fabric or an open lacy weave, depending on the weight and type of yarn used.